Hi, everyone. It's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm excited to tell you that my book is now for sale. It's called Divorcing Religion, a memoir and survival handbook. And I'll make sure you have a link in the notes for that. And also, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and become a member of my YouTube channel. Take care. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. I do have a content warning for you as we get going today. We will be discussing incest throughout our podcast today. My guest is Pamela Nickel Williams. Pamela was born into Scientology. Her parents were early Scientologists who worked closely with L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology's founder, at the first Church of Scientology in the late 1950s. Pamela and her parents were practicing members of the church until the late 1970s. After years of burying her childhood memories, Pamela began writing and documenting her experiences, seeking to acknowledge the abuse she suffered and to try and understand the dysfunction that existed within her family due to Scientology's beliefs and practices. Her memoir, Clearly Lies Are True, is a powerful and compelling firsthand narrative account of her experiences as a child during the early inception of Scientology. As both a cult survivor and a survivor of sexual abuse, her book chronicles her parents' search for total freedom, her sexual abuse at the hands of her father, and her mother's psychosis, which was brought about by Scientology. Wow. Welcome, Pamela. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Thanks, Janice. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you having me on your show.
Usually I start by asking people if or how their life was influenced by religion. And with yours, right off the bat, we know that Scientology was the religion. It's called a religion. Certainly many people refer to it as a cult. And you were born right into it. So what did that mean? What was that like for you as a child? Were you living on a compound with other families who also were Scientologists, or what was that like for you?
Yeah, great question. When we think about cults, that's what we think of, right? Cults that are on these compounds and they're, sequestered away and they're, told to do specific rituals and eat certain things and behave certain ways. So Scientology in the late 1950s really came out of Dianetics, the modern science of mental health that L. Ron Hubbard wrote in 1950. So my father was an early follower of Dianetics, and he lived in Kansas, and he attended training and auditing at the Wichita Foundation and Dianetics Foundation. And that's how he got started with Scientology. He, before that, had read Astounding Fiction magazines, which L. Ron Hubbard wrote Pulp Fiction, science fiction, and he was a big follower of that as well. So that was kind of his in. So in 1955, my parents got married, and my mother was not a practicing Scientologist or did not follow Dianetics, just my father. But he persuaded her, and they moved to Washington, D.C. And so from 1957 to 1959, they worked at the founding Church of Scientology that L. Ron Hubbard established after leaving Wichita. And if you know anything about L. Ron Hubbard, there was always a financial reason because he was always having financial issues and, IRS issues. And so they were there with him for 3 years. I was born there in 1958. So long time ago, but they were, at the very inception of Scientology. And they worked alongside L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue Hubbard, his wife. And I was born right after Arthur Hubbard, which is L. Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue's fourth child. And so our parents were, pregnant at the same time. My mother was pregnant at the same time as Mary Sue Hubbard. And then I was born shortly after that in the fall, after Arthur was born. So that beginning was very I don't have any memories of that, but from what my parents have told me or told me, they're both since deceased. And from what I've read and all the research that I've done, It was a very, I don't want to say grassroots, but I've used that word a lot. So that's the best word that I have, is that it was a beginning. So it was a grassroots movement. So it was exciting. It was a new way of thinking, all these new things, that my parents were involved in, along with other people their own age. And these were educated people. These were people with college degrees. These were people who were, in the mainstream of society. They were not on the fringes. These were articulate people, and they were swept up. They were swept up in that movement.
And didn't Hubbard kind of infuse sort of psychological language in with the things, the idea, the philosophy that he created and was promoting? So I think that would appeal to educated people, because it sounds like, man, there could be validity behind what this person is saying. Plus, he's famous, kind of, as a writer. Certainly, he would have been someone that your dad felt pretty excited to know, to be rubbing shoulders with. He had been reading the magazine and the science fiction works.
And Hubbard was very charismatic, very charismatic. Yeah.
There we go.
And, maybe to think about, what we know about New Age philosophies, in the 80s and 90s, and, that whole movement. I liken it a little bit to that. And I think also, thinking of my parents, maybe shunning religion in the way that they had experienced it as children growing up in the Midwest, looking for something different.
Wow. Yes. So did your mom seem to have any misgivings about it? So your dad kind of was already into it, and then she married and adopted it as her own belief system. Did she believe it to the extent that your dad did, or what do you even know about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't believe she did, and in writing my book, I've had to go back pretty deep and to remember a lot of things that I never had thought about for years and years and years. And so really trying to excavate that and to go into the psyche of my mom, and where was she in that? And I think she was torn. I think she was, really betwixt and between, because in the beginning, I think she was all in, from what the records that I found. I mean, there's records of my parents participating. They were part of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists. There's lots of newsletters where their names are there. My father was one of the first clears. So I know that my mom was not, but she was very active. And, there's evidence of that. But once we left DC and we moved to Colorado when I was about 3, we followed. Hubbard had already gone to St. Hill. He had gone to England to establish Scientology over there. And that was, because of IRS and the, financial problems he was experiencing. So they had to make a choice. And they didn't go there. They weren't going to go across the Atlantic. And they went to Colorado and followed a fellow Scientologist named John and Millie Galusha. And people established franchises during that period of time. And so he established a franchise outside of Denver, Colorado, and Golden, and my parents followed him. But I lived a pretty suburban lifestyle as a child. I think my mother kept trying to get away. Mm-hmm. And kept getting pulled in. Throughout my book, that's really the push and pull that you read about is, we went there to follow them, but my mother really tried to establish this suburban lifestyle. We lived in a tract home, the 60s dream, all of that in suburbia. And then we moved to the South, to Slidell, Louisiana, right outside of New Orleans. Most likely because of my father's job. He was a technical writer and he worked in aerospace. And so there was a big push in the South during that time. And this big plant was opened. And most likely that's why we moved there, because there was no Scientology going on there in this little town of Slidell. It was a really small southern town outside of New Orleans. But again, my mother embraced suburbia. She embraced southern suburbia. Our house, she decorated it like, a magazine, like Better Homes and Gardens with the furniture and the green, the olive green and turquoise decor
Mhm.
of the 60s. And so that all was happening at the same time that shadow of Scientology was over our lives.
How were your folks staying connected? This was long before the internet. So how were they staying connected with Scientology? Were there like monthly tracts or magazines or things going out to people internationally, or what was going on to keep them connected?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Yes. So those magazines came to our house. Yeah. I don't know if it was monthly or weekly. Scientology was really good at sending you all kinds of propaganda all the time. So I think it was more than monthly. So there was always something about Scientology. And they were always reading, it's called the Auditor's Bulletin, because in Scientology, auditing is like their form of counseling. And so they were always reading that. And that gave them the latest and the greatest news about what was going on at St. Hill. There was the St. Hill briefing course, which was like the next best thing that you had to come and get. Of course, it cost a lot of money, and you could only get it at St. Hill. So you had to fly over there. So there was always that underground, conversation happening, and my father pushing that and pushing that. And so subsequently, my mother succumbed, I guess, is maybe the best word for it. I don't know. I was a child, so I'm not privy to what that conversation was privately between them. But I remember them reading about it, and my brother and I took a passport photo. I was, let's see, 9, almost 9, and really 8 because it was after school was out. And my brother's 3 years younger. And we flew over to England, to East Grinstead. And my mother went to St. Hill.
Wow. Wow. And
Without
so,
my father.
well, without your father. Wow. So was that kind of her, like her true initiation, or like getting baptized into it? Or what was that about? Why did she go?
A great question. I wish I knew the answer.
Mm,
I wish I could have, crawled inside her head, or she passed sadly years ago, and I wish, and that's a whole nother tangent, but I wish I could have had these conversations with my mother, to help with that
yes.
healing and that understanding. So I don't know. I've only speculated.
Okay.
But my guess is the pressure from my father. The pressure from
Mm-hmm.
my father that was the next thing that needed to happen, and the pressure from those pieces of literature coming to our house, to fuel that. And
Mm-hmm.
so my father, he had to make the money because my mother did not work. It was the 60s. She was a homemaker. She was not employed. And so we were dependent on my father's, salary and on
So
his.
you and your brother went with her?
Mhm, mhm.
Okay. So then what's that like? And I recognize we're reaching back into childhood, 8 years old. What do you remember from when you were 8? But you're on an airplane, and then you're in another country on another continent, and your mom's taking classes, I guess. So what was going on with you kids then?
Yeah, yeah. And they're actually really strong core memories. When I started to write, those were the ones that I could remember. The others I had to dig a little bit deeper, but those memories I've always had clear memories of, and it was so exciting, really, to tell you the truth, as a kid, that we got to go and we got to get on this. It was the time when they had double-decker airplanes.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Right? Yeah, 66, 67. So we got to go on that airplane. I remember, drinking 7-Up out of a plastic cup. I remember looking out at the night sky. Like, I remember it was exciting. And then we got there, and, it was a hotel. And so that was exciting because I was a kid who had never done that. Very formal hotel. It was called the Harewood Hotel. And that was outside of East Grinstead in Tunbridge Wells, this little town. But that's where all the Scientologists went. So it was filled with Scientologists who were going to St. Hill. And then
Wow.
they would shuttle them over. They had shuttle buses. So it was exciting. It was actually, And I write about this, a freedom I hadn't experienced before. Because, I lived in suburbia and I lived with my parents and we had next door neighbor friends, but I never really ventured far from that. And so on this trip, we were in this hotel and my mom was gone at St. Hill during the day. Sometimes we were at the hotel by ourselves. Sometimes a little bit later, I think, my mother figured out she needed childcare.
For an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be the better way to go. And so we went to this nanny's house, and she was this young woman with a little baby outside of, I don't know what town, but somewhere close to, because my mother would come and get us. And she lived, I don't want to say bohemian, but it was a very 60s maybe existence. And that she was this model thin, beautiful English woman who had this little baby, but she had her little rickety chaise lounge out in the back where the hydrangeas grew. And she had raspberries and gooseberries that you could run through these vines and pick them and eat them. And she let us be kids. She just let us be kids. And so I have really good memories of that and helping her take care of her little baby. And I write about, from a child's perspective, because that's how my story is told, from that perspective, how I wished I could live with them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. How long were you in England then? Did you stay there? And was this during the school year or was it during a break time or?
Right. So no, it was after school. So I'd finished 3rd grade. And so then we went during the summer. And what I've learned about timelines, and you know this, Janice, from your work, is they get kind of mixed up when you've had trauma. So that's been really hard for me to really get that chronology down. But I'm almost positive that we had finished school. And then we had gone in the summer and then school started. So my mother put us in an English school. They're all Episcopal schools over there. And so she put us in an English Episcopal school. And we were in that school from the beginning of the school year, so probably around September, until November. So just a couple of months. So that summer daycare, probably then lapsed into the school, going to school. And then right before its maiden voyage, the Scientology ship, the Royal Scotsman, which was the ship that L. Ron Hubbard purchased, again, to flee the IRS and to go out to sea where those laws, would protect him. Right. He started this thing called the Sea Project, which eventually morphed into the Sea Organization, which still sadly exists today. We got on the ship. So we went from St. Hill to the Royal Scotsman. In the dead of the night, we drove to the docks at Southampton, and my mother and my little brother and I boarded the ship.
Wow. And were the other families also, everybody was kind of leaving land and getting onto the ship, or was it just a select few?
I believe just a select few. And why my mother chose to do that with my little brother and I. Again, I wish I could have that conversation with her, but to the best of my research and understanding and talking to other people, that have been on that ship, it was the beginning of that Sea Project. So there were people that were chosen, as crew to come on. But then it was also Hubbard's maybe vision to have auditing and training happening on the ship with public Scientologists as well. So my mother and my father were always public Scientologists. They never joined the Sea Organization. So they were on as public, and I know my mother received auditing while on the ship. And so I really think it was about that. And she had little kids in tow, so we had to go. And there were other families that had little kids because there was a nursery, where we were watched by a nanny, and we went to school with the Hubbard kids. We were tutored alongside the Hubbard children.
Wow. So how long were you on the ship for?
Well, we were on the ship from the maiden voyage, which was in late November. I don't have that date memorized, but I want to say November 27th, but I might be off by a day. So the maiden voyage, we were part of that. And then in December, all public were off-boarded. So we were docked in Valencia, Spain, and all of the public were off-boarded and sent off. And then in January, and I know this from Janice Gillum Grady, her book, Commodore's Messenger, A Child Adrift in Scientology. She boarded the ship in January. And so that's when this Real Sea organization started. And so part of that Sea project, that, ended, and then the Sea organization started. So only just a couple of months. But I, again, have strong memories, really core memories of that experience.
And are the memories like, wow, this was just an interesting thing that you had never been exposed to before? So your first trip on an airplane, first staying in a kind of a fancy hotel, and then first time being on a ship and living out there. So were you just kind of taking it all in and experiencing it as interesting, or was it scary?
Yeah. I don't remember feeling scared. I remember feeling curious. And I think also, and if you've been part of a cult or a religion and you become accustomed to things being different, it's the best word I can use. And so I think that I just didn't know any different. And so this was like the next thing that happened. Oh, and then we do this, and then we do that. So we had this nanny, and, we were there on the ship with other kids. And I write about some of the things that happened. I mean, there was the maiden voyage was horrific. It was horrific. The engine room had so many problems. I mean, the ship almost didn't make it out to sea. It was horrible.
Wow.
People have documented this in lots of other ways. And so as a child, I remember after that night, we sailed and going up to the deck, and everybody was cleaning off the water and doing different things and ready for Hubbard to come up and to inspect everything. And so my mother had my little brother and I helping, like it was an all hands on deck type thing. And so again, as a kid, you're like, oh, we get to do this now. Like it didn't feel punitive. It felt like something, oh, this is something new and something different and kind of fun that we get to do. Let's see what happens with this. Going to school with the Hubbard kids, it wasn't like real school. So that was kind of fun. We read from the World Book encyclopedias that they had on the ship that maybe they'd brought with them, what Mary Sue had brought for her kids. And I think because of my parents' earlier connection with Hubbard and Mary Sue, that is how we were allowed to be tutored alongside the Hubbard kids.
Hey, and was Ron Hubbard, was he on board the ship at this time?
He was. Yeah, he was.
So you would see him and talk with him? Like you knew, was he Mr. Hubbard, Captain Hubbard, Uncle Ron?
At that time, I don't know what they were calling him. I think LRH had started to stick. He had not officially become that Commodore that happened with the Sea Org. So it was sort of that in-between phase. I remember that people would say Ron is coming, or, L. Ron Hubbard is not his official words, L. Ron Hubbard, but Ron is coming, or LRH, wants it done this way. So I remember that. I remember while we were cleaning up, everybody's saying, well, he's coming. And I was trying to gain attention. And he looked right over me and looked out at the horizon, and there was no, affirmation. There was no acknowledgement. There was nothing, no recognition. Mm-hmm. We did learn a silly song as kids with the tutor that we went and sang for him one night. I have a memory of that, and him sitting there at his dining table. And I just remember the food, because food was not great on the ship. They started to run out of provisions actually until they could dock again. Yeah. So he had this huge plate of fruit. I remember just thinking, like, looking at that and thinking, oh, that looks so good. Like it was a huge plate, of fruit there. But I remember being nervous because you're performing, and as a kid, and I was very shy. And so I remember those feelings, but I don't remember fear. And it's so strange to me that I don't.
I'm glad you don't. I'm glad that fear is not kind of a core memory for you, because that can be a tough one to deal with. So then you're on the ship for a couple of months. Then you get booted off in Spain. Then what happened?
Then we went home. We flew back to Slidell, and that's kind of when all hell broke loose. And so when we talk about fear, I feared my parents. I feared the repercussions of their arguments. That's what I started to fear. And, and that I had early on, that compliance piece, when we, maybe talk a little bit about, the incest and what happened with my father, that's when that started. So there was always that. And then my mother, she had the volatile temper. And so you never knew when she was going to explode. Things would be calm, and then there would be the explosion. And so we got back, and that's what happened is my parents had this horrific fight. My mother slapped my father. There was coffee thrown on him. There was all kinds of, words said. But the gist of it was, she said to my little brother and I, you need to make a decision. Do you want to stay with, your dad, or do you want to go with me?
Oh my gosh. Oh, what a horrible thing to put on a child.
And especially after that, and I've never thought about it this way. It was like after that adventure, it's like then you go home and you're like, oh, okay, well, now we're home, thinking, okay, things will go back to normal, whatever that is, right? And which is the suburbia that I knew, even though there was always that shadow of Scientology. And then that happened. And so it was pretty disturbing. I was afraid. I did feel the trauma of that. And my mother left. She left for Los Angeles, California, and left us with my father.
Wow. And so did she exit your life completely at that point?
She exited it for a while. So we were left, in Louisiana. And probably part of that had to do with the school year also, because we were coming back mid-year. So that's one of the strange dichotomies too, Janice. It's like you can do all that with your children, but then so important, you better stay in school. It's like it just didn't connect, right? Mm-hmm. So what their priorities were. So we were in school. So I remember enrolling in 4th grade, but it was mid-year. And then I remember leaving in June. And so we took a road trip and packed up and followed my mother to Los Angeles. But one of the pieces of that never, I never put it together. I had a memory of it, but I never put it together until I started my writing, is that we left the house empty. There was nothing there. And I remember big trucks pulling up and loading up the furniture. And we had all this beautiful, furniture my mother had purchased. And we were told we could only take one toy with us. Everything else was boxed up. And I remember, like, I always remembered it, but with trauma too, you kind of just shut it out, and it's like, yeah, okay, like it seems weird, but I don't want to think about that. And it's just how it was. And so my parents lost the house; it was foreclosed upon.
Oh, wow! Oh, wow!
Yeah, yeah. They had spent so much money on Scientology, on that trip, on, it was exorbitant. And my father probably couldn't make that money fast enough. And so, yeah, they lost the house.
Oh, that's so sad. And how interesting looking back that you can, that piece of the puzzle in there. So did you lose all the furniture too, or did the furniture go with you to your mom in Los Angeles?
It did not. And so we lost everything. When we went out to LA, my mom had been staying in an apartment near the organizations, the orgs, as they're called in Scientology. So, after the Church of Scientology in DC, and then Hubbard going to St. Hill, where that was the hub, for Scientology. Then in the late 60s, early 70s, as the Sea organization had grown on the ship, the Royal Scotsman was renamed and became the Apollo. So it had an official Scientology name. And Scientologists who were trained on the Apollo were starting to come to develop the orgs in other parts of the United States. And so the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles and the Advanced St. Hill organization, those opened up in Los Angeles. And my mother was active in the first one, the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles. They call it AOLA. So those started to crop up, and those were being established as the hubs. And so then people were being, flown in and coming to LA to get their services versus going to the ship. So my mother participated in auditing and training through that, lived in this apartment. So all of this was housed, to Janice, in downtown Los Angeles. And so downtown Los Angeles, like any big city, like New York or, maybe Chicago is another, example, the downtown area is a little gritty, not where you necessarily might want to live, There were old craftsman homes that had been built, in the very early 1900s that Scientology bought up and started to house the organizations there. So they didn't even have true established buildings yet. So that's where all that was happening. And we lived in an apartment in downtown Los Angeles, which was very interesting compared to where we had lived in suburbia. So quite a culture shock.
Right. And then so you, with your dad, you moved in now to an apartment which is significantly smaller than the home that you had lived in previously. And had their relationship improved any, or did it just continue to be volatile just in a smaller space?
Yeah, it's a great question too. Hard to say. They were separate in so many ways once we moved, because my mom had already been participating in auditing and training. So she was already established with Scientology there. When we got there, she had already, had the apartment. And so we moved into that apartment, and my dad had to find a job. He had to start working. And so he found a job out in the Antelope Valley, which is about 50 miles away from LA. It's called Lockheed, which is an aerospace company. And he traveled, every day to that job. And so we barely saw him because he was working all the time, and he had to get up really early to go to his job and came home later. So really it was mostly my mom, that we were with, although she was pretty active with auditing and training. And so it was the summer. And I remember a lot of unsupervised time at the apartment building, with my little brother and the cast of characters that lived there, some other kids. The apartment building manager used to play with her son, and then there were a couple of other kids. And so we kind of fended for ourselves. There was a swimming pool. I learned how to swim, which was great. So again, kind of an adventure in that was different, to get to experience all of that. And you just don't know any better. It's like, then this is where we live. I knew it wasn't what we had before. And I think as a kid, you just don't know. So you're just kind of like, well, let's wait and see. Maybe it's going to get different. Let's see what happens next.
Yes. So then you're in this new space, but your parents are kind of absent because they are, your dad's working all the time. Your mom's falling deeper and deeper into the clutches of Scientology. And then move us forward a little bit then. At what point did your dad start behaving completely inappropriately to you? Were your parents still together?
Okay. Yeah, the history with that. So let's see. I'll address the Scientology piece first, and then we'll talk about my dad. So with the Scientology piece, my mom was going deeper and deeper. And that's a great way to put it. So she was immersed in it. She had done it on the ship, St. Hill, then the ship, and then now in LA. And the crux of it was that my mother was perceived as broken. My mother needed to be fixed by Scientology. So it was always, if you just do this next course, and that's how they rope you in. You still have this issue. You still have this, they call it a ruin in Scientology. This is something that you still need to work on. And so through all of that, and most likely she became clear on the ship, I believe, and then started the OT levels. She started to have some psychotic episodes.
Can you just explain for those who might not know, what does it mean to say your mother likely went clear?
Okay, yeah, sorry. All the lingo. So in Scientology, and this was established with Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. That was, L. Ron Hubbard's, beginning book before it morphed into Scientology. The goal was to erase the aberrations in what he called your reactive mind that were keeping you from feeling free, this total freedom that you needed. And so you went through auditing sessions, which is like kind of like counseling, that allowed you to look at these traumas and these experiences and to erase them from your reactive mind. And so when you did that, you became clear. Your mind became clear. So you're all knowing, you have all these special abilities to be able to deal with, everything. And so right. Wouldn't that be great? And so, my father was an original clear, and then my mother became clear. She was clear number 700, I believe is the number. And so that was the goal always, to become clear. And so once they got you to that stage, then Hubbard was always creating the next level, to rope in more followers and, you have to pay more money. And so he created the OT levels, which were about being an operating thetan. So in Scientology, a thetan, the best analogy is like a soul. So you are a thetan, but a thetan is someone who has been around forever. There's no limits. It's like infinity. And so, if you go really deep into Scientology with the operating thetan levels, it was also connected to some galactic stories, and there's some bizarre,
very science fiction-y.
Very science fiction, right? And so, in the beginning, though, those operating thetan levels didn't talk about that. Once you got into OT3, then it started to dive down that path there, and so many people, it's been documented, and I read about it and researched it, started to have some issues with OT3. And so that thinking in OT3, or the story, it's the story of Xenu, which is supposed to be in this galaxy, that these thetans are stuck on you, these things that you can't get rid of. Okay. And so you've got to get rid of them. And so can you imagine how that would feel like, to have to know that, okay, now you've cleared yourself. Now you have these states of enlightenment, but now, you learn that it's really not true. You've got to get rid of these things. And so my mother, like many other people, she suffered some psychotic episodes with that. And it was very hard to watch as a child. I was very afraid of them. She was speaking unintelligibly. She would have crying fits. So she was taken to a safe house in Scientology.
Oh, dear. Okay.
Yeah. So we went and visited her at the safe house. And in Scientology doctrine, the way to deal with that, Hubbard had come up with that in the early 70s because it was happening. So he had to establish some sort of protocol for it, was to give food, rest, isolation, and high doses of calcium and magnesium.
Wow.
Vitamin supplements. Yeah.
Wow. And so these people are having psychotic breaks related to some of this teaching that they were receiving, that they couldn't get rid of these things, beings, I don't know what to call them, that were grabbing onto them, that were somehow dangerous for them or bad. Um, and then the person is slipping out of reality. But instead of getting help that they actually needed by qualified mental health clinicians and physicians, they were sequestered. They were put away from everybody, isolated, and just given massive doses of these vitamins or supplements. And so then you and your brother are left with your dad, who's still having to go to work every day out of town.
Right. Right, right. And I love how you said without the help of, licensed therapists, counselors, people that could honestly help them. So sadly, my mother's condition, she was, she got to come back to the apartment, but it morphed into agoraphobia, and she had severe agoraphobia following that. And, that lasted for at least a year, maybe a little bit longer than that. So it was so sad. And she didn't get the help that she needed. She totally didn't get the help that she needed. Yeah.
Were your grandparents cut off, by the way? Pardon me for interrupting.
Yeah, they didn't.
Were cut off. Okay.
Yeah, I have one memory of visiting my mother's family. She lived in the Midwest, in Kansas as a child. I have a memory of that. But no, they did not correspond. I mean, maybe Christmas, she did not see them until they passed, when she went back to visit and take care of things. And then his father died when he was very young, and his mother never remarried. And so my grandmother on that side, I have a memory of her. Maybe I'm very little, so I don't even know if it's a memory, but it's a picture, of going to see her. But she came out before she passed to visit. In the late 70s. Yeah. But really, they were not connected. No, not connected at all.
Okay. Yeah. So then what happened?
Right. So my dad went to work every day. So again, fending for ourselves pretty much, and in the 70s, like, when I wrote about it and looked back on it, like, it was kind of normal to be latchkey kids. Women were going back to work, mothers were going back to work. So mothers and fathers were both working. And so that started to become more of a norm, somewhat of a norm, so it wasn't highly unusual, but it was just beginning. And so we went to school in downtown LA, and it was an inner city school. And we walked there. So we walked through downtown LA every day and walked home. Yeah. Wow. And again, didn't know any better, like, kind of exciting. Like, I'd never walked to school before, like, that was kind of interesting and different. And there were lots of sights to see, lots of things to look at, and we knew our route, and I was charged with my little brother, but I don't remember feeling unsafe. But I remember starting to acquire some street smarts, because I had been in suburbia. I didn't really have many street smarts. And, like, you stayed on the main street. You didn't go down the side streets. There were not the high concentration of homelessness that we have now, sadly. But there were always drunks and bums and, people that you wanted to avoid. And so, walking around that and past that, I did learn, that was the safer way for us to go. Yeah. So we went to school. Yeah. And so we were at that apartment building for all through 5th grade and 6th grade. So 2 years. And then what started to happen, and this is a sad part of the story too, is with my dad, he became ill. So maybe I'll go backwards a little bit in my chronology to talk about, the relationship I had with my dad. So I always had a memory, Janice, of sitting on my father's lap and him telling me we had a secret and that we had to keep this secret. And that's all I had. I never had more than that, but I always had that. And I always wondered, what was that secret? And as I grew up, like, thinking, was it Was it something he told me? Was it something I had to try to remember and I never could remember, like feeling frustrated that I could never remember what the secret was? And so, as a young adult, when I started to have some problems of my own, I started therapy and started counseling. I had left Scientology and was on my own and married by that time. And counselors always asked me, therapists always asked me if I had any sexual abuse. And I always said, no, not that I remember, and I never could remember. And so, we never traveled down that road. And in the writing of my book, which started after a traumatic incident that happened in my life, and the memories started coming. Yeah, and that was about 15 years ago. So, I'm in my 6th decade of life now. So I was older, and I didn't have any memories up until that point, just that one. And so I was having a heated argument with my husband. And I had this memory of, I had a canopy bed. I don't know if anybody knows what those are.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
But it was, it had the 4 posters, but then it had this beautiful little ruffled covering on the top of it. It's like a princess bed. And I had that growing up in Denver. And I could see in a flash, because I was looking at my husband's wedding ring on his left hand. It was a silver band. And I remember looking at that and had this flash of this canopy bed ruffle. And I thought, what is going on? Why am I thinking about this? My bedroom. So that kind of freaked me out. I was a little frightened by that. And then more memories started to come. And as you know, with, sexual abuse and all of that, the memories it's not like you get this, it's not like looking at a picture and it's all there. It's pieces. It's just these little pieces that you have to kind of try to put together. And it's feelings, it's sensations, it's smells, it's sounds, there's all of that. And because of the sexual abuse, there's disassociation. So, a lot of that, which I have dealt with my entire life, but didn't know that's what it was. I never knew that's what it was until, I got into therapy and we started to have these memories and was able to start to talk about them. So in the writing, I started to have more images of that. And so there was and the incest started when I was in Denver. And then my mother caught us in bed. And I have a clear memory of that. And
how old would you have been?
I would have been maybe 5, maybe 6, but I think I was 5. Yeah, I was 5. And her screaming and yelling, and and I clearly remember that. And then it was shut down by my mother. Shut down, and then it started again, but more secretively. And so that happened in Denver. And then when we moved to Slidell, I didn't remember those memories until really the writing about the story as well. But I always had this feeling in that house. Whenever I would try to remember that house, Janice, there was my parents' bedroom door, and I never could go there. Like I never could go into the room. My mind wouldn't let me. It was stuck. It was stuck there. And I always thought to myself, why can't I remember that house? I know, I couldn't remember my bedroom and I couldn't remember their bedroom. I could only remember the front parts of the house. And we went on a trip one time. I was pregnant with one of my daughters, and we were in New Orleans. And I said, I want to go see that house. And, I want to go. And I don't know why, because at that time I really hadn't have any memories or anything, but I felt like, okay, I just want to see if it's what I remember. And so we drove to Slidell. My husband drove us, and I went and I visited the next door neighbors who we used to play with. And I, talked to the parents there, and they were very kind. And then somebody was moving in to the house. And so I didn't want to disturb them because they were moving in. And I think I just walked up and I said, I used to live in this house. And they said, oh. And then, they didn't invite me in or anything like that, which I I'm not sure I would have gone anyway. But I stood there and I looked at the house. And I remember looking at the right-hand side of the house, which is where the bedrooms would have been. And I remember thinking, they're there. I know it's there. I wish I could go in, and see it. So that door just stayed shut for so long, like I said, until the writing. And then those memories started to come out. So that was pretty much the time when my father was taking care of us and my mother wasn't there.
Right. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry that you experienced that. That's a terrible, tragic, awful thing to happen. And so, is that something that continued occurring throughout your growing up? And then also, I'm wondering about when your parents ended up leaving Scientology. Like, what brought that about? But also, then, what was going on in the rest of your life? Do you even have recollection?
Yeah, yeah. So I do. So it is. It's as you know, healing is such a journey with sexual abuse. It's such a journey, and so finally, through the writing, definitely, I've come to terms with a lot of it. As hard as it was to write about, and as disturbing to think about that trauma of that little girl, that I was. But through therapy, after that traumatic incident activated all that, the therapist recommended the book, The Courage to Heal, which is, the handbook for sexual abuse survivors. And she recommended it, and I got it, and I opened it, and I read one thing, and I promptly closed it. Is before I wrote my book, and said, we're not going there.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a door I'm going to open right now. I mean, it scared me. It scared me so much. And I thought, I am not those people. I am not those people. That didn't happen to me, in what I was reading. And she had said to me, just read a little, because she knew me. I'm like an all in. And so, just read a little bit in little doses. And so I really couldn't. And, she was patient with me and kind with me, and knew as a therapist, that was not the thing to do to push me, to go there. And so that door stayed shut for a while. And then so with the writing, so all of that started to come out more and more. And what happened that I realized in the writing is that that was the end of it. It did not happen when we moved to Los Angeles. And I think most of that had to do with the fact that my dad was becoming ill. And he had been ill. He had multiple sclerosis, and it had not been diagnosed, but he had had symptoms with his eyesight going bad, and also with his legs. And so when we got to Los Angeles and moved to a different apartment building that was in a little bit better part of town, and mostly that was so my brother could go to a better elementary school, and then I was going to start what they called junior high, middle school at the time. And it was closer to one of the Scientology organizations, that the American Saint Hill organization that had been established. And so I think what happened is my mother was no longer, because of the psychotic episodes, going to be participating in Scientology at the first org. They kind of shuffled her over to the second org. And so we had to move over there. And she was still agoraphobic when we moved in. And my dad, within 6 months of moving into that apartment building, was disabled. He was in a wheelchair. And so, his trajectory was really quick, sadly. And my mother, because of the agoraphobia, was not going to the org, really because she wasn't leaving the house. And so they were still trying to rope her in. And I had not remembered this until I started writing. She did actually some transcription for Scientology, for the organization, because she was a really good typist, and she was doing some like piecemeal work for them. And I don't know if that was like a deal to pay for her to Scientology training or auditing, or what that was, but she did do that at home. And then she did start going there a little bit. But my dad was so ill that my mother had to go back to work. She had to find a job.
Wow. And So first, I need to ask you, we're almost at the hour point. Do you have another 15 minutes or so that you could spend right now
Oh, sure.
kind of winding things up? Okay, because your story is very gripping. Thank you for that. So we'll just keep recording. And so my question then is, does Scientology have things to say about when you're ill? Because I know some branches of Christianity, they say, well, it's a demon, or you're not praying hard enough, or whatever it is. Do you recall those sorts of things going on with your dad's illness and Scientology, or was Scientology receding into the background?
Of that question. So in Scientology, the dogma is that if you are ill, if you are sick, if anything is going on with you that isn't positive, it's because you're pulling it in. It's something you're doing. It's something connected to you. So you either have what they call an overt, something that you've done that's bad, that's making this happen to you, or a withhold, something that you're keeping secret and not letting out, not telling your auditor, that's keeping you sick, making you, have this condition. Doctors are not prescribed. You don't go to the doctor. It's not going to fix it. Scientology is going to fix it. So my mother sought no medical, advice, like you talked about, before. Sadly, she didn't get the help that she needed. My father, he did go to a rehabilitation facility to learn how to, navigate the wheelchair, how to navigate a bed that had a trapeze to get in and out of bed. And so when he came back from that facility, for a short period of time, he actually worked. He got hand controls on his car and he was driving out to Lockheed. And that was for a very short period of time. Thinking about ADA laws, though, I was really shocked, pleasantly surprised that they accommodated for him. That was a positive thing, that they allowed that to happen. He probably shouldn't have been driving, because I'm not sure how strong his hands were. His feet weren't working, but his hands. So then once he went into a convalescent home, because my mother couldn't care for him anymore, he was really out of Scientology. He did a little bit when he was in the wheelchair, and he did some at the local org. Actually, by then, Celebrity Center, which was another organization in Scientology that was opened, but the very beginning Celebrity Center, which was actually housed downtown, and where I did my Scientology auditing and training, had just been established in the 70s, and that's where he went for some of it while he could. But once he got into the convalescent center, the practice in Scientology, again, you pull it in, it's your fault. These things are happening to you because, you're not dealing with your overts and your withholds. And if it's gotten to the time where it's not going to get fixed, you're just going down further and further, it's time to drop your body. Because Scientologists believe, thinking of other religions like Christianity, that you're immortal. Scientologists believe that you're a Thetan, and that you've lived many, 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 many lives. It's like infinity. You're going to go on forever. There's no beginning and no end. And you'll just pick up another body and start over. So my father was counseled, to do that.
And so then what does that mean? So you're drop your body. I don't understand. Does that encourage people to end their lives, or do they believe this is just something that they can do with their mind? They can inhabit another body?
It's a good question. So it's not necessarily telling you commit suicide. I mean, it's not that clearly, dictated. Mm-hmm. But it's, if you were, I try to think of it with my dad. He went into the convalescent center. He never sought medical treatment. So there were fewer drugs for multiple sclerosis at that time. Now we've come so far with the research, but it was a death sentence, really. And I am pretty sure he chose not to take the drugs because that's who they were as Scientologists. And he took vitamins. I remember when he first got sick, he went to the health food store, which is like now they're on every corner, it's Whole Foods. Yeah. But back then there was the health food store that you went to that had, the unfiltered carrot juice and all, the unfiltered green juices. And he would buy those by the gallon. And he would drink those, thinking that those were going to help because of the vitamin A and the different vitamins. And so he never sought that medical attention that might have deferred it a little bit, And I think that he started to become very depressed. And that started to be his mantra, that it's going to be time to go, and then I'm going to come back and I'll have a new body. And I think he believed that at the end of his life, sadly.
So how old were you at that time?
So when you went into the convalescent center and my mom went back to work, I was 13. So he got sick at 13. He was in the convalescent center at 14. Yeah. So I was a teenager, and that's such a tumultuous time in your life anyway. So because my parents were no longer involved in Scientology, my mom had gone back to work, cured her own agoraphobia, surprisingly.
Wow.
Yeah. It was surprising that once she left Scientology, she was able to get a job and she was able to figure out a way to get there and, to make that work. That was a freedom for her. I know that. And then my dad in the convalescent center dealing with what he was dealing with. So I was offered up to Scientology. There's always going to be the next person you've got to, get in. You can't just stop. And so I started volunteering, or I was voluntold to go to Celebrity Center, and I started participating there. And that's when my Scientology path started. And I was active during 13, 14, 15, and then by 16, I had left. And my parents, they were not pursued, which is surprising to me, and maybe because I was the target, but I was pursued, Janice, to join the Sea Organization. And I was pursued pretty heavily to join the Sea Organization. And I was told that I didn't have to be 18, that as a minor I could join. I didn't have to have my parents' permission. And so I remember coming home, I was geared up, I was ready, I was going to pack a bag. And my mom and I had this blowout fight. And she said, she must have just seen my life flashing before her eyes, right? And she said, "You cannot do this. I'm going to call the cops. If you try to go, I'm going to call the cops." And I was afraid. Like maybe she would. I didn't want to go to jail. I really didn't know. And she seemed so adamant. And I was also a little bit torn as a teenager in that I'd started to explore outside of Scientology with friendships and boyfriends and things like that, and some youth groups that, were not religious based. And I liked that. And so I was sort of stuck in this place where I was doing Scientology on weekends and at nights, but then doing these other things with school, on the other side.
Thankfully. Yeah.
Thankfully. So two Scientologists came to my door, to the apartment door, and my mom wasn't home. It was just my boyfriend, who was very tall. And I opened the door and they didn't come inside. I didn't invite them inside, but it was after that fight. And they said, "Where have you been? We haven't seen you at the org lately." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I've been busy with school and this and that." And, and obviously I had a boyfriend there, so they knew what I was busy with. And they just said, "Why don't you come by? We're offering this," or, whatever it was going to be, the event that was happening at the org. And I said, yeah, okay. And that was it. And I never interacted with Scientology again after that.
Oh,
I was saved, though. I write in my book, I dodged a bullet.
Really did. And so how long did it take you to unpack the belief system? Had you ever truly believed it? Were you already questioning it?
Well, I'm still working on that one. It is so insidious, as you know, religious beliefs and cult beliefs. So I think I'm better at, it's just such a journey, but I think I'm better at being able to say to myself now, and I would say the health piece, the doctor piece is really embedded in me. And I think that's a lot to do with what happened to my parents. And so you'd think that I would be all in with doctors and, doing all the right things. And I have this fear of doctors, this fear of medicine, this fear that I still grapple with of, is that really going to help me? Can I really trust that? And I think that's just so embedded in my belief system. I think the other pieces have been easier for me, to deal with and to kind of, what do I want to say, deconstruct, and decompose and say, okay, that's rubbish. Like, you can't believe any of that. That's just garbage. That was just craziness. So, things like, drop your body and, Thetans. I am very spiritual, but I would say that I'm not a believer in Thetans. But I do hold on to some of those pieces of, how do I help myself through exploring what's going on in my mind? But I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think that's more a therapeutic thing.
And you have mentioned that you have worked or you continue to work with a therapist to some degree. So that's just fantastic, to have a person who can be your touchstone and potentially offering you ways to do reality testing around the beliefs, either the beliefs that you still have or the beliefs that still have you, giving ourselves permission to step back and explore, who delivered that belief to me? How old was I? What was going on in my life? What was their purpose or their presence in my life? Was it an elder, someone I had to listen to and believe because my life depended on it? So getting to that point where we can really start asking some hard questions about the beliefs that may still be shaping our life or impacting our decisions. So I'm really, really glad that you made your way out. You weren't heavily pursued after that one time when they came to your place. And I know that your book has so much more. We're like barely scratching the surface. Is there anything more that you wanted to share about your story before you tell us how people can find you?
Oh, thank you, Janice. Just to piggyback on that, trust is the biggest piece. So anybody listening, it's about finding that person you can trust, that therapist you can trust. And so that's a huge one when you're a survivor of abuse and a survivor of a cult or, a religion that you decided to divorce yourself from. So just being patient with yourself. I just want listeners to know that, that it's a journey. It's taken me a long time. And it's not finished. Those doors just keep opening and you get to keep walking through them and you get to keep healing. So that's positive, the positive piece.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So,
and the idea of, sorry, go on.
And forgiveness. I just always want to end on that it's taken me years and years and years to forgive, years. And it doesn't come easily and you can't force it. You can't force it, but you can get there. So I think that's the hope also, that you can get to that place where I can forgive my father, I can forgive my mother. It doesn't erase what they did, but I can forgive them because I can understand it and have some empathy for it.
Right. And some people might also look at that as getting to a point of being able to fully accept reality, the reality of what was done to you, what happened, the reality of who your parents were and what impacted them potentially. And once we accept that, okay, this actually is a thing that really did happen to me. And then we're on solid footing to move forward and really take back our life and decide the direction that we want to move in. And so for you, writing has been powerful, therapeutic, eye-opening, in a way potentially to help others too. How can people get your book or find out more about you?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm on social media. I'm not a fan of social media, but I am on social media because I want this message to get out there. So my story, Clearly Lies Are True, If you go on Instagram or you go on TikTok, that's I call it my handle. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but that's how you can find me. I also have a link tree on my Instagram, so you can see all the podcasts I've been on. You can go to my website, clearlyliesartrue.com, and you can also order my book on Amazon. And so it's going to come out officially August 31st, and it's going to come out in an ebook, a paperback, and I just finished recording the Audible in my own voice. So you'll be able to get it in whatever format works best for you. And that's August 31st. So you just go on the link on Amazon, or if you just want to click on Amazon and look up Clearly Lies Are True, it'll pop up.
How exciting. Congratulations to you I know how hard it is to write a book, especially when it's a book about ourselves, because it just stirs so many things up. And then there's a degree of vulnerability also when we are offering our story out there to other people who might not understand it. I think your book has the potential to be helpful for a lot of people. It's certainly very interesting. So thank you, Pamela, for joining me today. I really, I'm so grateful that you reached out.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. And I'm so thankful for platforms like yours where I can tell my story and hopefully it resonates with whoever's listening. I am on my website. I wanted to add to, going to have a blog so that if people want to blog and have questions, I can correspond with you.
Great idea. That's just wonderful. Thank you again for joining me. And I will just remind folks who are watching or listening that I offer a free online support group for people recovering from religious trauma syndrome. And those people come from many, many diverse religious backgrounds, Scientology included sometimes. So that's something people can check out at my website, divorcingreligion.com. Thanks for tuning in today, everyone. Please take care, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks again, Pamela.
Thanks. Bye-bye.